So let's clean things up a little bit over here. Again, never a bad thing to get muscle memory going, even if it's just for an HTML page. And going in here and putting in the closing tags here. Do this a lot. Become a little bit better at typing it, making sure they understand what the structure is. We'll find out later on that this structure is actually a tree structure where we have a hierarchy here, where HTML is at the top. There are two children tags here, head and body. These two things are, the head and the body are considered siblings. Let's keep this relatively simple here. Now we've got nothing in here. Here's our body tag, and there's some interesting things we could see here. First of all, we get a few ideas here. If we look over this, and I'm looking at, all I'm doing here is using my Chrome tools, and there's a lot of stuff going on here, but just going over here and selecting the body of my page here, or actually just selecting this body tag, I can see a few things. You look at this, and you can think there's not much going on here. If you look down over here, you'll see that there actually is a margin. There's no border here. There's no padding. And this is just telling us that the body is taking up all of the available space that we have here. And if we were to go in here, and I'm going to put in some styles, but for now I'm just going to end up putting it right in line. So styles we can end up putting in line. And each part of a style is actually made up of style rules. And I'm going to end up putting in a rule that says the background color, and again, there's a lot of these as well. I'm going to make the background color, I'll use tomato. Could use red. Tomato maybe is a little bit less jarring here. So one of the things we could see here is that there's this margin that's built in. So what does that really mean here? Well, let's go over here, and I'm going to put my hello world. And I'll refresh it. So notice if I go over here and I click on this, and again, with my Chrome DevTools, I can see that there's a margin here. So built in, by default, this is the default of the user agent, which is kind of the default style sheet that is set up for Chrome. I imagine there could be some way for an individual user to configure this, although I haven't never really done this. You could actually get an idea of, why this is sort of moving away from the corner. There's a margin. So really everything that we end up doing for the most part in HTML, and really this is true in general for HTML, is that everything is made up of boxes. And this box that we have here for our body, which is the main box that the user ends up seeing, has a margin. If we didn't like that margin, we could go over here and say, hey, look, the margin is going to be 0. And we'll find out that we have to use measurements sometimes, or say, 0 of what, but if it's 0, we don't have to do that. We can just say 0, and here we see it moves right up against the side. So this just gives us an idea of, how with a container we can end up controlling how that container works. Let's do a little bit of a better example here. Let's go over here. We could keep this here, and let's put a div here. And we'll put a div, and let's just give this a little bit of style as well. And for this, we'll say that the style is background color. Let's do Dodger blue. Now, if I end up doing that, I'm not going to end up seeing anything. And one reason for that is that a div has to have something in it in order for it to have anything meaningful going on. If I look down here at the bottom of my Chrome DevTools, I'll see that it has no height that's here. It's interesting that it does go all the way across the page. As I move this in here, I'll see that the size of that div ends up getting smaller. But if I went over here and I put in my hello world here, all of a sudden I'm going to see that div. So this is kind of interesting, because if we look at the default behavior of a div, we'll see that it has no margin and it doesn't have any padding. Well, what we can end up doing here is that we could say, hey, look, we want to have a little bit of room within this. And so if I go over here and I say, hey, look, I don't want the hello world to go right up against the edge of this container, I could go in here and put in a padding. So we think of padding, if you thought of a picture frame, the padding would be on the, you can think about it almost like the mat inside of a picture frame, where the margin is, how those pictures relate to other pictures. So I'm going to go over in here and put a padding. I like to use the rem notation, which is really the M, but it's based on what the size of the letter would be in the main document. I think for what we're doing, either one of these will probably end up working at the moment. But I should see that if I look at this, if the padding over here, it sort of makes sense. If the padding over here for our body tag, our margin is 8, right? If we look at the div, well, it'll actually tell us, hey, look, the size of a capital M letter is about 16 pixels, because that's what the notation is here. I just find it easier to work with the rem units. I could think a little bit less. I don't have to think, is it 12 pixels? Is it 14 pixels? Is it 19 pixels? I just think about how many capital, the default size of a letter is somewhere around 16 pixels, and I do, variations from there. So if I wanted this to be a little bit closer to the edge, I can make it 0.5 rem. And if I was to go over here and put a few of these here, I would see that they would be stacked up right next to each other. But if I wanted this top one to have a little bit of room, I could go over here, and I could also set a margin. So I could say the margin, I'm going to make 1 REM, and I would see that this is going to have a different behavior. First of all, it's going to give me a little bit more of a margin from my body, but it's going to give me a little bit of space here from the top to bottom. If all that I was looking to do was to basically control how this element at the top interacted with the one on the bottom, another thing that I could end up doing is I could say, hey, look, just worry about the margin on the bottom, in which case I would just end up doing this. One thing that we'll find out is that the margins kind of collapse. So if I went over here and I put in margin top on this one of 1 REM, let me do this correctly, I don't end up seeing a difference here. The margins kind of overlap each other. But if I made this 2 REM, I would see it would end up going up. So really, the big takeaway here is that margin is what's outside of a container. Padding is what you end up having on the inside of a container. And more importantly, we can end up controlling the style of an element by putting tags right in it. We're going to find out that this is going to be a little bit messy, and there is a much better way to do that. And we're going to end up doing it with styles rather than doing it this way.